Welcome back, everybody. We hope your bellies are fed and your minds are now fueled to take in what will be the marathon session of this conference. We are scheduled to run for the next 2.5 hours with 5 speakers and a discussant. And so my task is to rigorously enforce our time limitations. We're going to go in the order of what you see in the panel. The overarching rubric of this panel is the question of Europe, the case of European countries. And we will begin with Geneviève Zubrzycki, continue with Matthew Francis, who will talk in order about Poland and the United Kingdom. And then we have 3 papers on France, Valérie Améraud, Romain Sez, and Christian Jobke. And then we'll conclude with my amazingly capable and brilliant colleague, Sarah Song, as a discussant. Our speakers are both emerging scholars and world-renowned, and I think it's fantastic to have this kind of heady thoughtfulness in terms of thinking about how to structure both the content of this as well as people at different places in their career. And so we really welcome the opportunity to talk about these topics together. Okay, so without further ado, we'll begin with Geneviève Zubrzycki.
So, in an essay on the Mojave cross she published on the immanent frame, Winnie Sullivan pondered why crosses present such a difficulty for the modern secular nation-state. And she questioned... Okay, so Winnie Sullivan pondered why crosses present such a difficulty for the modern nation-state, modern secular nation-state, and she questioned the degree to which religious myths and symbols have been supplanted. No, questioned the degree to which religious myths and symbols have been supplanted by those of nationalism. Has secularization failed? She asked. Sullivan posited that religious symbols' ability to connect the universal and the particular is at the root of their success. Yet the ambiguity of the Mojave cross and the commentaries made by various judges evaluating the case point to the layered religious and secular meanings of the symbol at that site and in U.S. society more generally. Perhaps a more expansive definition of civil religion can trace how the same symbol moves across religious and secular context, depending on the site, event, or time in which it is deployed. In Poland, for example, the cross is and is not religious, although it is always or almost always sacred. This ambiguity, this ability to pivot in different directions may help to account for the cross's social force. And I think that some of my comments will touch upon those made by Olivier Roy and Enrique Klaus this morning. So like the US, Poland is a religious society with 96% of the adult population declaring belief in God and 70% attending religious services at least once a month. Unlike the United States, however, Poland is ethnically and denominationally homogeneous. It's 96% ethnically Polish and 95% Catholic, at least nominally. This lack of religious pluralism has not diminished debate about the place of religion in the public sphere. And actually, that issue has been hotly debated since the fall of communism and the construction of a legitimate national state. So there's a new context that has forced actually the re-examination of things that had been taken for granted under communism. And Poland, former Eastern European or communist countries, offer actually interesting comparative cases to think through the changing meaning, social power, and political valence of religious symbols and practices. So when we think even of the current revolutions in the Middle East, it might be helpful and instructive to look at other cases. So some of the debates that have punctuated the post-communist period: should Poland be united under the sign of the cross, as many on the right have argued, or should the state embrace confessional neutrality? Should there be an invocatio Dei in the new constitution, the 1997 constitution? Should crosses be present in classrooms, state institutions, or broadly conceived public spaces? And these questions under communism actually were quite obvious. The answer was no from the party state and yes by everyone else, the opposition, including believers, non-believers, and Jews. So once, with the fall of communism, this entire issue is reopened, is put back on the table. These questions became especially salient in the debate surrounding the controversial erection of hundreds of crosses just outside Auschwitz in 1998 and 1999. Ultranationalist Poles chose the cross to mark Auschwitz as the place of Polish martyrdom, as opposed to the place of the Jewish Shoah, and as a strategy to defend an explicitly Catholic vision of Polishness that had been slowly but surely been eroding since 1989. And in my book, I actually develop and analyze both axes of this War of the Crosses. Today I'm talking about primarily the second axis, the one concerning the place of the cross as a symbol of Polish national identity. The action garnered significant support from the four corners of Poland and beyond, but it ultimately backfired since most Poles no longer saw the cross as a sign of freedom and dissent from an atheist party state and its totalitarian regime. For liberal intellectuals from the left and center, the cross now stood up for the rejection of the principles of the Reichsstaat, where particular allegiances are relegated to the private sphere. For liberal Catholics, the cross had become a sign of intolerance toward others, used as a provocation contrary to the Christian meaning of the symbol. For many members of the clergy and episcopate, the crosses at Auschwitz were a shameful expression of Polish nationalism and anti-Semitism. It took several weeks for the Catholic Church and its hierarchy to try to contain the situation. At first, it stood by the sidelines, arguing that it did not have the monopoly over the symbol of the cross, which belongs to the entire community of Christians. But once the schismatic brotherhood of St. Pius X took over the site and started celebrating masses claiming to represent the true, quote-unquote, face of Catholicism and to defend the true face of Polishness, the episcopate finally intervened on two fronts. First, it issued a pastoral letter forbidding Catholics to erect more crosses at Auschwitz, asking also those who had brought one or many to retrieve it or them. And secondly, it attempted to restrict the semantic orbit of the cross by emphatically promoting a quote-unquote correct theology of the cross in various venues. Although some Catholics did continue to bring crosses at the site throughout the fall and winter, despite these explicit demands, the War of the Crosses was basically ended once the Church took a firm stance. But it took about 3 months for the Church to intervene. That very summer, however, the Łódź court rendered a judgment on a related civil case filed a year before. A self-proclaimed atheist had sued the city for displaying a cross at a city hall, arguing that it infringed on its private well-being. The suit was grounded on Article 25 of Law 2 of the 1997 Constitution of the Polish Republic, which was ratified a year before, which concerns the religious and philosophical neutrality of public organs. Yet the lawsuit was rejected because the court ruled that the cross, as a traditional symbol in Polish culture, had been objectified to the extent that it did not constitute a threat to anyone. And that's actually going back to some issues we discussed this morning with Professor Ferrari's paper. The Court of Appeals maintained the regional court's decision, arguing that in the Polish patriotic tradition, the cross express a specific set of moral and historical values. And then I cite what's on the slide here. Personal well-being cannot be understood without reference to the tradition, culture, and historical experience of the collectivity in which physical persons live and function. In addition to its religious meaning, the symbol of the cross has been inscribed in the experiences and social consciousness of the Polish nation as a symbol of death, pain, sacrifice, and as a way of honoring all those who fought for freedom and independence in the struggle for national liberation during the partitions and during the war against invaders. The symbol of the cross has for centuries designated the graves of ancestors and the places of national memory. In non-religious collective behavior, the meaning of the cross as an expression of respect for and unity with the liberators of the fatherland even has precedence because other universal means to express respect have not been developed, Poland not being independent for most of the 19th century. Moreover, according to the court, the cross was expressly related to secular state institutions. In addition to its religious meaning, the commentary went on, the symbol of the cross in Polish society expresses moral order on which the idea of the state and society is based. Throughout history, the cross has been, in the Polish tradition, linked with the legislative and judiciary powers. This fact does not in itself prevent dialogue among people representing different worldviews. So the religious semantics were overshadowed in both courts' decisions by its secular, quote-unquote, merely cultural and civic connotations. Its secularity made it no less sacred, however. So does this case suggest a diminution of the public centrality of religion, with the cross deemed tolerable because it has been sufficiently secularized, and thus not evocative of religious sentiments? Or did it present a hypertrophy of religion, with the cross becoming so omnivorous and all-encompassing as to devour the Reichsstaat entirely? Perhaps the cross's religious meaning, however occluded as quote-unquote merely cultural, is the champion left standing not only at Auschwitz, but over the nation as a whole. 12 years later, in the summer of 2010, Warsaw became the site of yet another War of the Cross, when self-proclaimed defenders of the cross prevented the relocation of a wooden cross standing in front of the presidential palace. The cross, erected at the site in the days following the tragic death of President Kaczynski, who was killed in a tragic plane crash in April 2010, was supposed to be moved from the presidential palace square via religious procession to a nearby church. So that's the picture you see on the left. Defenders on the cross, however, aggressively prevented the church-less ceremonial relocation. And you see here a woman dramatically tying herself up to the cross with national colors. So they prevented the church-led relocation, which they understood as a profanation of the symbol and of the nation. For several weeks, the site of this new War of the Cross became the playground for proponents of the cross, but also the stage for protest against the religio-nationalist and anti-Semitic Poland that the cross has come to signify since the fall of communism, a signification acquired partly through previous controversies, such as the War of the Crosses at Auschwitz. In addition to serious endeavors like the signing of petitions against the presence of the cross at that specific site and for a stricter separation of religious and political spheres in Poland, parody and mockery of the defenders of the cross and their crusade against the secular state have been quite effective. So what you see here is a pillow battle War of the Cross, or in front of the presidential palace, Elvis impersonator, people basically taking the streets to show how absurd the mission of the defenders of the cross were. So they wanted a circus, we'll give them a circus, announced a Facebook group coordinating a counter-protest. Within hours, more than 7,000 Facebook users confirmed their participation in the happening. Radio Maria, a right-wing conservative radio station that many consider a sectarian movement, countered the initiative by appealing to its listeners, especially to its male listeners, to counter-demonstrate against the counter-demonstrators. And the streets of the city were flooded with people, some who prayed and protested, others who picnicked and partied, or just happily peeped. And I'll show you other pictures of this because they're actually interesting. So the Facebook initiative specifically asked people to show up in front of the cross without any religious or national symbol. The goal was to kind of drown the defenders of the cross. So you see them, posters where there's a cross, there's a party, clowns, Hello Kitty, and also more political or significant posters were Polish too. So it's interesting how the cross there was not just about the place of religious symbols in public sphere, but what the cross means, and that secular people in Poland are also Polish. So it took several weeks for the authorities to finally relocate that cross. Barricades had to be installed to prevent the defenders of the cross to monopolize the site and invite chaotic responses. In the end, once order was restored, several weeks after the planned relocation, the cross finally found its permanent home in a local church nearby. Its meaning, however, has been altered. Over the last 2 decades, and with controversial actions such as those 2 war the crosses, the cross is no longer a symbol of unity of civil society or of unity between Polishness and Catholicism, but instead has become a symbol of the very tensions within Polish society about the meaning and place of Catholicism in Poland. The cross is left standing, but as a symbol of conflict. So what broader lessons can we learn from the Polish case and from these 2 specific events? I opened with a mention of Winnie Sullivan's comment. So Winnie Sullivan asked if the failure of national symbols to replace religious ones suggested the failure of civil religion and secularization. Civil religion, following the Durkheimian tradition, refers to the social sacralization of a given group's symbols. In the modern era, according to this view, civic or state symbols like the flag acquire religious significance and are worshipped by citizens as totems. The Polish case points to a different and somewhat overlooked process. Because of Poland's specific or peculiar political history, it was not political ideals, institutions, and symbols that were sacralized and became the object of religious-like devotion, following the paradigmatic French Revolutionary model, but religious symbols that were first secularized and then re-sacralized as national. The cross in Poland is therefore what I call a sacred secular symbol. It is sacred not only because of its Christian semantics, or even in spite of these semantics, but because since the 19th century it has traditionally represented Poland. In the place of religion yielding to nationalism, or nationalism becoming a religion, here religion becomes nationalism. In cases where national identity is experienced and expressed through religious channels, the estimation of religious decline or ascent in relation to national identity is a chaotic mission. When the religious is secularized and then resacralized in national form, the relationship between national symbols and religious symbols is particularly difficult to tease apart, as much for social scientists as for judges. This ambiguity, this ability to pivot in different directions, may be precisely the crosses and other analogous symbols' source of civil religious power. The national sacralization of religious symbol, however, is meaningful and garners consensual support only in specific context. This is what we discussed this morning in the case of Egypt, for example. It has been fiercely contested even in overwhelmingly Catholic Poland since the fall of communism and the building of an independent state. Such symbols could certainly be, quote-unquote, secularized again. Secularization, in the sense I'm using the term now, would mean, however, returning to a more distinctly religious or theologically orthodox interpretation of Catholicism in Poland. The depoliticization of religion has indeed been the objective of many Catholic groups in the past 2 decades. The agenda would restore the, quote-unquote, truly sacred status of what has become, in their view, merely a national religion. After Catholicism's long public career, many Polish Catholics now lobby for its privatization. Thank you.
Okay. The paper that I'm presenting today is actually a co-authored work between myself and Professor Kim Knott, who is also based at the University of Leeds. And it's based on research that we've undertaken together and also separately. The paper in its entirety is available on the website for this workshop, so what I'm going to do today is just summarize some of that. And I'll start off just by giving an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to critique the secularization thesis, being the dominant paradigm for explaining religious-secular relations. And I'm going to provide a critical discussion of assumptions underlying this secularization thesis and the contemporary discussion of religion in the public sphere. Then going to explore the sacred as a concept to signal deeply held values on both sides of the religious-secular distinction, before providing a resource for locating the sacred within religious secular ideologies. And I'll be doing that by suggesting a matrix of markers that can be used to identify and capture data relating to these deeply held values. I will then go on to provide some examples of how the sacred within contemporary debates can be mapped out using this resource. I'll be concentrating on the Rushdie affair as an example that shows the persistence of references to the sacred in religious and secular discourse. One which also throws into sharp relief the discursive religious-secular struggles within British society. And also recognising the sacred as both secular and religious, we argue, opens up constructive potential for serious democratic debate between differing ideological camps. And so I'll conclude by offering some examples of the value of this approach for policymakers and analysts. So the withdrawal of religion from the public sphere has been understood to be a decline in the influence of religious values and institutions on society. Whether this decline is a result of the waning of religious belief or the retreat of beliefs from the public sphere to the private world of individuals has been contested. However, despite varying positions on the continuing resilience of some forms of religious beliefs, the arguments are generally more or less framed in relation to the secularization thesis. In addition to academia, this has been accepted by popular European discourses in government and the media, and also, but to a lesser extent, in the United States. Assumptions about the dominance of secular ideals are so popular that the return to the sacred, as it's put, in domestic and international arenas has elicited surprise, even in academia, as shown in the call for papers for this workshop. Institutions, values, ideas, places, and people are assumed to fall into either one or another category, church and state, faith and reason, belief and science, and invariably from the American Constitution to the French educational system, the British National Health Service, this separation has led to the marginalization of religion in the public sphere. Likewise, when this boundary is threatened with transgression, it's seen as an imposition that should be forbidden, hence the opposition to public displays of religiosity in the clothing of nurses in the National Health Service in Britain or to school pupils in France, for example. Within these debates lies an idea of what constitutes religious forms and their opposite, the secular. However, we argue that the idea of religion as a reified concept can be seen to have its place within the development of European Christianity, for example, in the distinction between religious and secular vocations. As such, the oppositional religious-secular binary can be seen to be a relatively recent and clearly Western construction. Religion is commonly construed in emic terms by people within Western cultures as religious institutions, their traditions, beliefs, and practices, and those who, to a greater or lesser extent, adhere to them. And then secular is seen as all that falls outside of this definition. We argue that, or certainly we say that discursive division of these categories suggests that they should not necessarily be seen as an either-or dichotomy. Furthermore, we argue that the boundary separating them has rarely, in practice, been impermeable and is subject to struggles and movements between them. So, for example, Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, rarely discussed religion despite the established status of the Anglican Church in the UK and despite his own faith. Conversely, George Bush, although the head of a government with strict separation from any particular religious institution, frequently invoked gods in matters of state, and it's not just Bush as a president who's done so. So we argue rather that we should see this as religion and secular as being located as separate camps within a single epistemological field. And this diagram, which you're probably having difficulties reading, at the top left-hand corner of the triangle shows the religious sphere, at the top right-hand side the secular. And we've also shown, because we're portraying the field dialectically, a third post-secular position. But I'm not going to discuss that much more here. We're going to focus solely on the dichotomous representations of the religious and secular field here. By drawing on the concept of the sacred, we aim to problematize the discursive distinction between these two camps, and thus to trouble the notion that we are seeing a return to the sacred in contemporary modernity. Instead, we'll suggest that the sacred never left modernity, and that a proper exploration of it provides an explanation of its apparent return, and indeed a clearer understanding of the relationship between religious and secular thought. So in the case of the Satanic Verses controversy, the debate between the two opposing camps was played out in terms of a struggle, with each side vying to assert the undeniable truth of their position and the uncompromising nature of that of their opponents. Interestingly, both invoked the language of the sacred and of non-negotiable values. That such language and values were not confined to the religious camp supports our assertion that, irrespective of any decline in religious belief or belonging, the sacred had not disappeared from modern European society. This diagram is a development and utilizes the earlier diagram to illustrate the oppositional ideological positions articulated so forcefully during the Satanic Verses controversy. Strong Muslim positions were pitted against equally vociferous secularist ones in a discursive struggle fought out in the public media. And so again, on the top left-hand side, you see sort of various Muslim positions. On the top right-hand side, various secularist positions. And the arrows between them are representative of the struggles between the different camps and the different positions held. So both sides of the argument drew on the language of the sacred to represent the importance and non-negotiability of their case, and repeatedly referred to the gulf or boundary between the two positions. Such boundaries can lie dormant, invisible to outsiders until they are threatened with transgression. And here I might refer earlier to Professor Roy's discussion of the cross as part of the furniture until noticed. In the case of the Satanic Verses controversy, the deeply held but quietly expressed strength of feeling around the sanctity of the Prophet Muhammad was suddenly challenged, and Muslims were seen to rise up and protest in a way that surprised many secularists within the UK. But their response also led liberal secularists to come out in defense of Rushdie and his freedom as an author to express himself. And so, in short, secularists also realized the sanctity of their own position as a result of this threatened transgression. So the concept of the sacred that we're utilizing here finds its genesis within a Durkheimian notion of things set apart and forbidden, although we've developed it in the context of recent spatial and cognitive approaches to the study of religion. This observation is supported by the theoretical contributions offered by neo-Durkheimian anthropology, for example, in the cognitive cultural account of the Finnish scholar Veikko Antonen. In his discussion of the sacred as a category boundary, Antonen argues that the sacred is not confined to the religious context. Rather, he says that in acting as a category boundary, the sacred binds together those inside the boundary at the same time as separating them from those outside of it. This understanding of the sacred, unlike the religious-secular distinction, is not a construct of modernity and indeed cuts across the modern religious-secular dichotomy. The claim that one's position is non-negotiable can be made by any exponent according to the beliefs and values inherent in the worldview to which they subscribe. When such a position is strongly articulated, when a sacred boundary is transgressed, then differences are realized, dichotomous stances become apparent and battle lines are drawn, as in the case of Muslim and secularist protagonists during the Satanic Verses controversy. So understanding where these non-negotiable boundaries lie is essential for policymakers and analysts in order to avoid and to understand the potential within society for conflict and thereby to avoid it. Therefore, we suggest a matrix of markers that can be used to assist in this process. Focusing on the public discourse of groups, these markers can be used to identify and capture data relating to key variables, such as the expression of dichotomous worldviews or external legitimating authorities. They may signal conflict and even suggest capacity for violence. Utilization of this approach may assist in identifying and negotiating the sacred territory of various ideological positions, help in intervention and conflict mediation, and assist in policy formulation in areas such as public order, radicalization, and community cohesion. And these markers that I'm referring to were developed from earlier research that Professor Knott and myself were part of in preparing for the British government's Home Office, where we highlighted some gaps in understanding the move to violence in religious beliefs, but also have been developed iteratively through case studies since then, primarily through the doctoral research that I've been undertaking. During each of these case studies, statements made by particular groups in the form of interviews, treaties, propaganda, and so on, were coded into the markers. And when new areas for examination became apparent, new markers were developed to capture this information. So it was an iterative process. Some of the markers captured more information than others, and we suggest that additional markers could be developed in the light of future research projects. There's not a fixed list. And I'm just showing you a list here, which you'll find impossible to read. So I have highlighted a couple just to give us a couple of examples. And these will be a couple of markers that I'll use as examples in this case. So first of all, dichotomous worldview, which we defined as an oppositional and dichotomous worldview or cosmology. Or external legitimating authority, defined as a worldview justified by appeal to legitimating authority external to or transcending the situation that the statement has been made in. So it could refer to God, religious scriptures, traditions, or values such as fundamental human rights. So the dichotomous worldview, this is the first marker that I'll look at some examples of. This marker captures values that expound a them and us mentality, and which suggest a worldview influenced by a struggle between opposing forces, such as, for example, God versus the devil, good versus evil, enlightened versus unenlightened, or believer versus non-believer. A group expressing itself in this way views itself as on the side of good, and a clear distinction is made between those within the group and those without it. So these distinctions are evidence of the kind of non-negotiable values or strongly held values that groups believe differentiate them from their other. The following is a good example I'm going to discuss here, a quotation from Salman Ghaffari, the Iranian ambassador to the Holy See, during the Satanic Verses controversy, who viewed the struggle as one between all those in the religious camp against all those in the secular camp. So the interviewer asked, in the appeal you made to the Pope on February the 15th, you described the Pope as a defender of spirituality and of religion. Are you thinking perhaps in terms of a kind of holy alliance between the Catholic Church and Islam against modern unbelief? And Ghaffari answered, this holy union has existed from the beginning. Islam has always hoped for this collaboration. Our history shows that Islam and Christianity can live together like brothers. Let us leave aside the ideological conflicts of the past. We hope that Christianity, with the help of Islam, can carry this world towards God and toward faith, preventing all oppression. So in this quotation, Ghaffari is suggesting a dichotomous worldview dividing those who have faith in one God from those who do not have faith, as we saw represented in those diagrams that I showed earlier. It shows the struggle between these different camps. As Islam and Christianity are more commonly presented in mutual distrust and opposition, we can see that this idea of a dichotomous worldview can be found to suggest unlikely partnerships and values. And we discuss more examples in the paper than I've shown here. The liberal secularists also upheld a dichotomous worldview, and this is echoed in a statement published by the centre-left New Statesman magazine. We are embattled in the war between cultural imperatives of Western liberalism and the fundamentalist interpretations of Islam, both of which seem to claim an abstract and universal authority. On the one hand, there is the liberal opposition to book burning and banning based on the important belief in the freedom of expression and the right to publish and be damned. On the other side, there exists what has been identified as a Muslim fundamentalist position. And the different camps here demonstrated self-defined divisions in how they viewed the world, divisions marked by values relating to the sanctity of the Prophet in Islam or to freedom of expression. Although we're demonstrating these values in relation to the Rushdie affair, it's apparent that they still play driving roles in defining positions held by more contemporary debates, such as the Danish cartoon affair. So the external legitimating authority marker has been defined in such a way that it also captures legitimization from non-religious sources, such as through interpretations of secular ideologues. In terms of non-negotiability, this aspect is not stressed much more strongly than in the command to kill, expressed by Khomeini and explained here by the Iranian journalist Amir Tahiri. Sometimes true believers must act even before any harm is done to Islam. The Prophet is quoted as saying, kill the harmful ones before they can do harm. And Rushdie too invoked an external legitimating authority, in this case freedom of expression, which he wrote is at the very foundation of any democratic society. And later saying, it is an essential part of any democratic system that people who act within the law should be able to express their opinions freely. The above examples show how the matrix can be applied to the Rushdie affair with some examples and some discussions based around two markers. The matrix, in its operationalization of the sacred, can identify and focus attention on the public values of the group to which it is being applied. In this case, we have chosen the Rushdie affair as it not only provides examples of Islamic religious values which are publicly expressed in many countries, not just Britain, but also because it is a good example of where secular values were demonstrated to hold the same non-negotiability. This reinforces, we argue, our claim that the sacred has never been absent, even within secular ideological systems, at the same time as demonstrating a new method of analysing the presence of religious norms in the public sphere. So recognising the sacred as both secular and religious opens up constructive potential for serious democratic debate between differing ideological camps. In the above examples, we drew on the values expressed by liberal secularist defenders of free speech and those who held Islamic values. And by doing so, we highlighted what was distinctive about the eruption of the sacred in public discourse in both religious and secularized environments, and how such instances may contribute to the construction and maintenance of non-negotiable identities. This matrix of markers constitutes a methodology that can contribute to public understanding about the importance of sacred beliefs and values for people's identities, deeper knowledge about secular society, and secular society are the beliefs and values found within it and their relationship to those expressed within religion. It shows how these beliefs can be interrogated and challenges assumptions about the relationship of religion and the secular with reference to the sacred. So I'm now just going to conclude with some final comments. The model that we have suggested, the matrix, allows those interested in the ideological norms of groups to explore sacred boundaries. It is apparent that the greater understanding that this methodology brings about of the importance of sacred beliefs and values to the identity of groups would have been of public benefit. Such an understanding could have helped bridge the gap in discourse between the liberal, secularist and Muslim communities that clashed over the satanic verses. It also deepens understanding of the nature of religious values within secular systems, as well as of the similarities between systems in terms of adherence to matters of sacred concern, that are generally seen only in oppositional terms. We suggest that this matrix has utility not only in academic studies of the religious norms in public and private spheres, but also in policy applications. Through application of the matrix, the above benefits could help shape policy to be sensitive to areas of potential ideological non-negotiability. Thank you.
I was thanking everyone, so that's why I was shut up. So I again thank the organizers for the invitation, and also Sarah for bearing with my lack of organization and being so patient with me and the paper. And I'd like also to highlight that the edited version of it has been very much provided by one of my postdoctoral students, Valérie Behiri, who really reread it and made it real English. So that being said, it's difficult to say anything new about the headscarf and the burqa ban in the French context, because it seems that in front of such a knowledgeable audience, everything is known and everything is has been said. So what I want to try to do, and it's the first time I'm presenting this paper, which is not based on fieldwork, what I usually do, or based on what others do and I've been reviewing. So it's something that is more of a policy paper as a result of a discussion we had in Florence last December. And the organizer invited me saying that they would appreciate a policy paper rather than a strictly academic one. So I've been trying to do that, and I hope you will be patient again and really looking forward to your comments about that attempt. That being said, the 20 minutes are starting. There are many ways to talk about the burqa and the headscarf in the European context. One of them is recently shown up by these two people who were walking in the street of Paris. You don't need to hear it, you just need to look at it and to watch it while I'm talking, trying to listen to me though. So the argument exposed in my paper is rather simple. European publics are trapped in a binary representation of Muslim religious practices as, on the one hand, inadequate and threatening to liberal Western democracies. In the paper, I address this by fleshing out the following two ideas. A, in European context, France constituting the primary example, religion remains largely unintelligible to public imaginaries and politics. B, the headscarf burqa bashing current moment illustrates what I call the construction of religion into race, engendering a racialization of Muslims in Europe as their religion becomes to be conflated with race. So in the first section of the paper, I ask whether the European Union can be fair to Muslims as a religious minority when religion remains non-intelligible as a variable. So in the first part of the section, I briefly sum up what has been evoked this morning, some of the social perplexities that have emerged around religious Muslim issues in the EU over the last decades, and I'm not insisting on that. I'm just summing it up by saying that it is as if Europeanization could only consolidate itself through the shared ideology of what Ford calls anti-Muslim bigotry and what Goldberg calls European Muslimania. In particular, I focus on the way in France, secularism in this sense is increasingly conflated with, or at least seen as interwoven with, national identity as recent statements by the French leaders of the National Front. That's enough. That's enough image. Gonna get more later. National identity as recent statements by the French leaders of the National Front, amongst others, have shown. However, this discussion, this political ideological discussion, all point to what has been evoked again this morning, the thornier issue of defining religion. I'm not insisting, it's further developed in the paper, but this awkward and even redundant, to some extent, question of definition, issue of definition, has become a daily routine for a lot of social agents. Let's think about the judges, lawyers, public officials, doctors, and social workers who are confronted with having to decide whether or not people have the right to do that, to wear a headscarf or a burqa, file a complaint for religious as opposed to ethnic discrimination, be granted refugee status, close their shops on certain days, obtain their divorce, etc., etc. So defining religion is no longer exclusively a boring scholarly duty, but it has become an everyday requirement for many people in social life, in particular in the courtroom, as we heard this morning. So in Europe, secularism has a political achievement, specific, of course, national traditions notwithstanding, has conditioned the circulation of an expectation of religion to be considered only in terms of its institutional manifestation rather than as practice or experience. So the everyday, the ordinary practices, the everyday religion that is performed through everyday accomplishments is missing. From the European secular perspective, a believer is a practitioner. In short, European political spheres reduce religion to institutional definition productive of a certain social order. Favoring other dimensions would mean paying more attention to the various ways of carrying out the practice of one's beliefs in one's daily ordinary activities. And here I'm relying again on artistic view because I think they're always missing in academic work, as if we don't have time to look at them. With Olivier, we co-organized an exhibition 7 years ago in La Villette, and we had the opportunity to look at the work of Razel. Razel is an Iranian artist who is playing and working on herself in the Iranian context, playing with her niqab or chador. And I'm here, as at the beginning, just letting the images flow behind me. Because she is just putting herself into daily situation where she is doing normal things, like having a shower or boxing, training. There is a very funny one where she's sunbathing with her burqa, and she's obviously playing with the contextualization of this religious practice and trying to distort what we attribute to the meaning of the burqa when we look for it and look at it from outside. So this missing everyday religion is something that strikes me in looking at the way we look at burqa and headscarf in the perspective of banning them. So, however, this general incapacity to view religion in a very comprehensive definition is, I think, very well illustrated by two examples that I develop in the paper, and I'm not insisting on that. First, what I call the silence and inaction of anti-racist groups. It's striking to see how in Europe anti-racist mobilization is ignoring the religious discrimination part of it. So again, in the paper, you find more examples, including one that is a recent call by the Indigènes de la République in France to defend the mothers wearing headscarf and who are prohibited to accompany the kids into schools. Another illustration that I develop in the paper is that the concept of discrimination itself, in its legal meaning, that is including the fact that the religious group of the victim may be a reason to exclude or prevent from access to certain goods, came to constitute a central notion when it refers to ethnicity and color of the legal and political framework that is established in Europe to guarantee the promotion of equality and respect of differences. But it has remained largely absent from the discourse about Muslims and Islam, in particular in the French context. So, again, enough with image, also because it has not been working very long. I think the current European tendency that is moving towards more restrictive definitions of cohesive citizenship is particularly well illustrated again by these two artistic pictures that are, for me, identifying quite significantly the trap in which legal analysis is actually sitting when it looks at religious signs, in particular headscarf and burqa. Basically, the main analytical grid that is underwriting the headscarf and burqa bans is based on it is not that we don't like Muslims, therefore it's not racism, it is that we love our values. And you can decline that according to many political voices or registers. And this means, and the European Court of Human Rights reading of laïcité favors very much such a stance, that the protection of historically cherished liberal values, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, gender equality, can tolerate the restriction of some of them, meaning religious signs in certain space. In the ongoing recent discussions involving Islam and Muslims, religion as a mode of subjective experience again remains largely incomprehensible, and we've heard that when Sylvia was presenting this morning, to European public imaginaries and political classes, and thus draws a cultural line between groups of citizens or populations. I, in the paper, developed that further with relying mostly on the work of Mayanti Fernando and Sabah Mahmoud. The alleged clash between secular liberal values, as illustrated in these two pictures, and Muslims' forms of religiosity reveals the European normative encoding of religion. And here I really insist on that idea that the secular code that is circulating in the European Union only does justice to a specific form of religious subject, ignoring a large part of it. And as again Sabah Mahmoud says, this way of conceiving religion has become as normative as attributing race to biology. The second section of the paper is precisely trying to reconnect the reading of religion as a new race with the idea of a process of racialization of Muslims in the European Union. Here I'd like to draw the attention to what I call the missing dimension of race in the analysis of the headscarf burqa bans. And I'd like pretty much to invite comments and discussion about that, to think of the growing social anxiety they induce as an indicator of the racialization of religious difference that eventually leads to racial subordination, to take on Vacan's vocabulary. And in particular, this is striking when this difference concerns Muslims. Anti-religious prejudice, we know that, and racist prejudice are never far from each other. Neither are Western irreligiosity and racism. Of course, Islamophobia may have, for a while, seemed to be a useful concept to acknowledge the role of religion in the intersectionality of discriminatory situations. However, 10 years later, anti-Muslim bigotry, again, has only intensified, and the conditions for the production of a specific folk devil seem to be at their peak all over Europe. Of course, I'm aware of the fact that the concept of racialization is not entirely satisfactory, and Goldberg has very much invited us to think about the easy temptation to simply call racialization what is race-inflected, so the description of race-inflected social situations. Here, what I want to do is really to connect the possibility of a racialization of Muslims, that is, of attributing them with categories, physical, moral ones, with the specificity of Europe as a racial context. So in the paper, of course, I address the definition of race, of racism. I go through the work of a lot of scholars. And I also insist on the way I use the term race. Race evidently has no definition that relies on biological lines. Let's be clear. Race is here transcending identity and color in a way. It is a set of conditions that allows for social stigmatization and depreciation. But it does not exist per se. It does not exist in isolation. Rather, unstable, polysemous, it is contingent upon other factors and may thus be best described by what Stuart Hall called the floating signifier. For instance, labeling the black head-to-toe veil a burqa, as was highlighted by Enrique Claus this morning, perfectly illustrates the non-fixity of racialized signifiers. At the veil, Afghan woman in the characteristic blue burqa is simultaneously seen as a specific symbol of oppression under the Taliban Islam, but also transnationally as a victim of an alien culture. The ideological power and of this embodiment of multiple meanings is so strong that even in Iceland, I don't read the Reykjavik Grapevine every day. I just happen to fall on this February 2011 cover that highlight the fact that this ideological power of this embodiment of multiple meaning, because even in this non-European country, of course, where no burqa had never been seen, and it is written in the article, MPs started to discuss the interest of having a law to prevent the ban of the burqa, while there is no burqa on the island. So this is a good illustration of what I mean when I talk about deterritorialization and racialization and the power of this racial embodiment of difference when it circulates in place where it doesn't have any political meaning, neither a social one. So I don't insist on the post-colonial approach of this frame of discussion because it has been largely covered by other authors and I don't have time to do it here. But what I want to do is now come back to the public expression of hostility, or let's say unease, with issues related to the presence of Muslims in Europe and in particular in France. This phenomenon has been probably facilitated by what I call a twofold dynamic. On the one hand, what I label as a euphemization of the reality of Islamophobia. And in the paper, I quote many public reports that really directly points to the fact that Islamophobia is not racism, and publicly states that. And most of them are not NGO, but are public agencies producing yearly reports, in particular in the French context. So on the one hand, you have of this twofold dynamic, you have the euphemization of the reality of Islamophobia and discrimination experienced specifically by Muslims. It does not exist. It is not different from ethnic discrimination, and we lack evidence. Usually, these are the three arguments. And on the other part of this twofold dynamic, you find the diffusion of explicitly racist statements pronounced by major political figures, and in particular people, actors, and TV personalities, that both political major figures and public figures at large, I mean TV personalities, for instance, in the French context, create what I call the conditions of the normalization of a racist discourse in the country, almost elevating it to the level of a national public discourse. Now I'm going to just mention one example that I developed along with others in the French context in the paper, and that's why I've highlighted these two images that we're very familiar with. But what we forgot is that they really illustrate how a social problem is made a reality in a context where it does not at all rely on the same historical background or the same historical and social significance. So we have on the one hand, on the left side, the Front National advertisement of the election of 2010 that was prohibited and punished by a legal decision. And on the other side, you have the minaret referendum poster that led to the result that we know. And you see very easily that the iconic dimension of this aesthetic of the threat is very similar from one context to the other, playing again on this floating signifier that is very operative in many contexts. So another illustration, and it was again highlighted this morning by Olivier in particular, is the fact that we see in the European context populist discourse, populist leaders from very different backgrounds coming up and popping up as legitimate defenders of the secular order. And this is something that the fact that the laïcité is patrimonialized by the National Front, by the extreme right-wing part of the political spectrum, is something extremely new. And it goes together with, for instance, the fact that the same figures, the same political figures, stand in defense of the gay rights, illustrating perfectly what Poor has developed under the label of homo-nationalism. And I think this is something that is, again, circulating very much throughout all the European context. So the Islamization of has become a central political motto and cultural reference in most of the European Union member states. While academics, and this is the last part of the second section of the paper, while academics mostly agree with the idea that there is an inadequacy of conceptualizing racism exclusively as the physical categorization of populations, headscarves burqa bans, in fact, permit what I presume to be a racialization process of Muslims, precisely because they provide European publics with physical elements denoting what it is to be Muslim, just as race uses color to signal differences among people. Women with burqas are attributed levels and types of competencies that are mostly negative ones: incapacity of choosing the right thing, incapacity of standing up individually, etc., etc. I'm not developing because I still have 5 minutes, and I'd like to say the final words I have to say about this racialization process. Can we track it, this racialization process? I would say yes. First, Muslim women are made into a category defined by their incompetence to make the right choices in a secular liberal context. Second, they are found, these women, trapped in interlocking systems of oppression, labeled Islamophobia, as a euphemization of racism. The external signs of female belonging to Islam, wearing a headscarf, wearing a burqa, helped the ranking of human beings by reference to selected embodied properties and secular incompetences so as to exclude them. And again, poor terrorist assemblage is a very good and very thoughtful conceptual tool to illustrate what I'm trying to convince you of. So the headscarf burqa bans organize also something that is, I think, too often missed: the oscillation between, on the one hand, an active form of racism, and on the other hand, a more inferential one. For instance, the fact that we constrain women and we prohibit in France the hiding of one's face in public is something that is also, at the end of the day, obliging a fine to be paid by both persons. Not only the woman cannot be outside with what she wants to have on her head, but the one who is constraining her eventually have to pay something. So this idea of the double blame is something that is also very rarely analyzed in looking at why this ban and why this enforcement of the similar kind of legal enforcement in different contexts. If we consider veiled women from a more horizontal and intersectional perspective, they appear not only as targets of a state and a nation, but also reveal their embedment in a web of social relationships that multiply the possibilities for them to be designated as illegitimate social actors in whatever role they aim at fulfilling: mother, co-educator, citizen, artist, spouse. So the racialization process becomes racist and not only race-inflected, in that it directly touches the body of the covered woman, her very clothing to be considered as part of her own body. And again, I rely on Poir's work. Now, if we push really to the extreme, I would be really interested in a reading of the extreme reaction of some young Muslim women, when it came to banning the headscarf in public schools, when they decided, for instance, to shave their hair. And so denying not only the Arendt's mask of citizenship that was the secular order, but also cutting off their hair. So not appearing, not even as a seductive potential woman with long brown hair, as the Orientalistic imaginary would have convinced us of, but really taking off everything, all masks of citizenship, again, in the Arendtian perspective. And again, while Marine Le Pen, the new leader, is very easily comparing street praying, collective praying in the streets with the Nazi occupation. She didn't say Nazi, she said German occupation during the Second World War in Paris. There were no allegory or no analogy made with the fact that this Muslim chef, the women, reminded us of something that is a kind of slippery memory in the official traditional history. As a conclusion, and I thank you for highlighting that, I was at the end of my time, what I wanted to insist on in this paper was the fact that there are many tones that we can take to talk about this issue. We can be very serious and very ethnographic. We can be very philosophical, we can be very legal, we can be very faithful to what the actors say. But we can also look at some other way of expressing positions towards this thing. And I've used systematically or almost artistic positionings by Muslim persons, mostly women. This one is Princess Hijab. She lives in Paris. She used to live in Paris. And she has been tagging all the famous advertisements in the Paris metro, making that what she called a cartography of crime. But as a conclusion, I would like to come back on what we expect from a policy paper is also not only ask questions and make connection, but eventually suggest things. And I'd like to come back on the reason why I wrote and I started. I felt comfortable with writing such a paper that is not hiding anymore behind the academic window and wall of references that we always use when we speak about this subject. The principal motive that led me to write this paper is both personal and professional, and it revolves mostly around the following question. Why is it that anti-racism discourse is so prevalent in academia and does not transpire more into larger society when it comes to Muslims? This is something that is striking for someone working in this field and facing constant questioning, whether from within academia, colleague from my department, or from without. For example, as you may have seen this morning, in very ordinary family life. My pseudonym on Skype is headscarf. The first word that my daughter was able to identify in English was headscarf. So I don't know if I should be proud about that, but that's one of the ordinary family life illustration of the constant questioning. What is it? Racial profiling here and religious identification converge in the object of the headscarf and burqa ban. The overlapping of faith with garment phenotypical attributes effectively racializes Islam and Muslims. If this is so obvious, why is it not spoken of? Why is it so few discussed in our circles? I think part of the answer is in the fact, and I will be short, that academia is very divided on the topic, which no doubt makes it difficult for politicians and ordinary citizens, as we say in sociology, to wade through and make sense of our works. I've identified, and this was the funny part of the paper, at least that's what the people who read it told me. That's funny, should write a book on that. 6 dominant families, I think, are actually operating in the field of working on Muslims and headscarf/burqa bans in Europe. There are 6, and the first are the we are Muslims, so we know better, either defending or criticizing the bans. The second family are the radicals. This is a rather complex group that is consisting of a contradictory mixture of cultural essentialists, feminist views, and that are globally pleading for a liberal, democratic, fair, secular order. A third one are the rational moralists. They keep hierarchizing values, considering it better to protect certain values, certain groups, individuals, over others. The passive-aggressives, they are my favorite ones. Shouldn't religion have disappeared by now, is their main question. The ideological activists, they are the number 5. They are rather espousing a rather prevalent forms of anti-racism and demonstrating an explicit an explicit will to be the authors of what they call complex analysis. Everything is complex, often using a post-colonial and queer studies perspective. And the final family is the one I call the stick-to-description family, that keep bringing in ethnographic work or legal dissection of political reasoning. And the list is, of course, not exhaustive. It's pretty much related to my own experience and to my own embeddedness in this field. They all have, however, something in common. That is, they have a difficulty that is growing, I think, to do justice to the religious part of the discussion and a reluctance to connect the headscarf and burqa explicitly and conceptually to broader key questions such as this one, a very simple one. Does the burqa ban law affect the larger situation of Muslims in Europe? Now, what can be done? People keep telling me, look, it's possible that the public opinion and the publics, European publics, would change their mind. And indeed, Leila Ahmed's recent positioning in foreign policy was quite illustrative of that. So I think time could be an option. And there is also the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That's the one Michel Lamont and Mizrahi are developing in their recent piece in racial and ethnic studies. I'm quite skeptical. I'm skeptical because I think time and people are not always reliable. And let me conclude with one illustration. For instance, 10 years ago or so, Italian local crusades were organized in Veneto to prevent the construction of mosques by bringing in pigs to urinate on the piece of land that would be granted to Muslims to build mosques. In November 2009, a referendum passed forbidding the construction of minarets in Switzerland. So as a professor, I think the only viable option seemed to me to be the insistent use of the essential tool of good pedagogy, repetition, using clear, defined concepts, and keep doing that. Thank you.
So what I'm presenting today stems for the preparation of a PhD in sociology about imams in France, prepared at the HESS. Thanks to the PUF grant, I have been able to make a great deal of progress in this work. While contemporary Islam is more often analyzed as an institution rather than a daily practice, I like, on the contrary, to approach an institution still not well known as an object of research, the decades-old imamate in France, from a bottom-up perspective by examining the daily religion of imams. Since September 2006, I have visited around 30 mosques where I took part in various activities. And I have interviewed about 40 imams. I'd like to show a key role of imams in institutional change, not by analyzing my own observations by political sciences, but to the light of the debate in sociology of religions. Keeping in mind two specificities of Islam in France, even in the West, namely the Islamic pluralism and the experience of the minority condition, I will try to show that imams maintain their legitimacy and exercise their authority by positioning themselves at the crossroads of multiple influences which interpenetrate with globalization, and in so doing, they become agents of Islam's formatting. It what appears in first from their practices of domination. When religiosity don't fit anymore into a common horizon of sense, they are intellectualists. Studies about priests and pastors in France show that they reinvent the exercise of their authority by integrating this dynamic, and it's legitimate to suppose that the Islamic magisterium can't escape it. This first hypothesis clarifies several reports, and I'll discuss two cases. I begin with the case of conversions. It appears that in most of mosques, imams impose a preliminary training on people who want to convert. What does it mean? This denotes a loss of relevance of the declaration of Shahada as a rite of passage. that expresses a rejection of ritualism, which is a consequence of the disappearance of the religious evidence. And imams remedy it in imposing a training on converts. So they reinvent the rite of passage by intellectualizing it. In the same way, most of sermons that I heard are becoming an original product. The emotional strength, the art of public speaking, which is a traditional characteristic of the sermons, and which participate in the efficiency of the transmission, tends to be eliminated. It is a consequence of a choice that imams explain. They want to be understood by many faithful who have different origins and so who use different languages. Rather than to be eloquent, imams prefer simpler and more accessible speeches. But the art of the public speaking is incompatible with the dynamic of explanation of religiosity. Displays of encyclopedic knowledge figure more prominently in sermons. As about the rite of passage, imams reinvent the literacy genre of sermons by intellectualizing it. So, religious leaders do not exercise their authority violently because they cannot. These two cases, among others, suggest to go further. The domination is not practiced by the violence, but by the intellectualization. So, in the process of institutionalization of Islam in France, an Imam Islamologist is appearing. That is the creation of an original exercise of the Islamic authority, which can be moved closer to the declericalization of the priesthood and to recent evolutions to the pastorate in France. And it is as such a first aspect of an institutional integration of the Islamic magisterium in the same paradigm as other religious authorities. This first hypothesis calls for one second. Indeed, this way of practicing domination involves a repositioning of imams as religious authorities. In France, they have progressively become the leader of their local community and, in the absence of a central legal authority, they also have been placed in a position to reinvent orthodoxy. Now, this work is confronted with two specificities than other religions also experiment in the West. The experience of the minority condition and that one of the intra-religious pluralism. My second hypothesis is thus that imams, building their legitimacy at the crossroad of these multiple borders, they also reposition themselves as religious authority following the same way than other religious leaders. For being shorter, we'll only pay attention to some general observations about sermons and consultations which illustrate this process. Firstly, in a sermon which treat of more or less debated questions, and there are many, we can observe that imams have sometimes ambiguous speeches. For example, about the women's status in Islam, a same imam condemns with strength the feminism which would be responsible of the main trouble in the West. At the same time, he pronounces in favor of the sharing of houseworks between husband and wife, and his sermon insists on the primacy of the respect toward women without defining it. Often interpreted as the fact of double speeches, this kind of ambiguous constructions results from the fact that imams address both to a plural congregation, riven by divisions, and a surrounding society where Islam is stigmatized. Besides, this ambiguous construction of sense in imam sermons go with a wide berth given to the semantic field of consensus. Imam sermons in France often insist on the fact that some values as love, respect, tolerance, mercy, etc. should be stronger than any other consideration. It is a first thing of an imam repositioning as religious authorities facing pluralism. Secondly, the counselor function. From several cases of studies about questions as the famous case of the dating of Ramadan fast, which generate conflicts each year in French mosque, or the daily conflicts between faithful that imams manage, an observation is evident. Rather than adopt a magisterial posture, it means position themselves as the only holders of the truth which they try to impose from above, imams build their legitimacy by mediatizing faithful claims, and so they try to reinvent, by a democratic fashion, the horizons of acceptable consensus. So this ambiguous construction of sense and the primacy of consensus, semantic field in imams' sermons, as a search for democratic consensus in imams' consultations, are different aspects of a same repositioning of the Islamic magisterium, which adjust, in so doing, to individualism and pluralism. This issue is, in various respects, really comparable to that of the Catholic Church in the 20th century, as analyzed by the sociologist Daniel Hervieux-Léger, and to the process of democratization which seems to be perceptible in the evolution of the Catholic and Protestant theologies from the second half of the last century. It is what Monseigneur Rouget, a French archbishop, calls a fragile Christianity. So what we can qualify by analogy fragile Islam is another aspect of an integration of the Islamic authority in a common paradigm with other religions. But with the specificity that it is elaborated from the bottom by the daily practices of imams who fit and retranslate in legal and theological terms transformations of the contemporary Islam. So these actors who have no appropriate training and often stigmatized are agents of an Islam formatting in an interface position between a simple evolution of religiosities and the repositioning of Islam in itself. They question Islamic institutions and, somewhere, they summon them to react. It remains to be seen if they are up to this challenge. This result suggests some practical consideration in place of a conclusion. It is because imams act on the border of the plurality of influences which interpenetrate with globalization that they acquire this key role in institutional change. It is as such, if we open ourselves honestly to a positive secularism, an expression still dear to some French policymakers, that it is interesting to wonder about imams' utility and potential for social cohesion. Without being alarmist, it is nevertheless important to be attentive to a situation in France, even in Western societies. A French sociologist entrusted me a little time ago his anxiety about the increase of daily tension starting in several districts of the Parisian suburb between inhabitants and some neo-fundamentalists. We are attending today, and in France at least, to a rejection of Islamic markers in the public sphere, considered as foreigners, and at the same time into a growth in the use of Islam as identical reference, and to a multiplication of pockets of softening. This tension generates a potentially explosive situation that imams have a real potential to diffuse and that it is possible to exploit. For example, by training them in the mediation or by accompanying their repression in the public sphere. French imams began to arouse the interest of public authorities and opinion in the 90s, when they appeared as conduits at risk of introducing into France the conflicts which trouble the Maghreb. This mistrust toward the imam is still relevant today, while they are proving to be decisive agents of normalization and integration of Islam. It is a quiet, but structuring, determining, and desirable process. It would be largely wrong to waste this potential for social cohesion, It is at high time to bet on these dangerous social actors.
Start anyway. The book here with me again. Has everything been said about it? It rather appears to me one can read almost anything into it, and the challenge still is to say the right things about it. What I'm going to say about it, this French Burqa campaign leading to that legal prohibition, is quite different from the angle it has been addressed here today. I read it not as it has been commonly read, as an exercise in reverse Talibanism, or you could also just ridicule disproportionate gunning down by a law, such a paltry small phenomenon that does not even address 1% of the Muslim population in France. I propose a third angle to look at it. It shows, this whole campaign shows the extraordinarily high legal, constitutional hurdles that have to be taken, that have to be jumped above in order to make this prohibition possible. This paper went through several incarnations. I thought I had finished it by March 2010, after the Conseil d'État said, no, a general across-the-board prohibition is not compatible with our constitutional and with European human rights law, for that matter. So I was smiling, I was confirmed, and then I was really sitting down and writing it, and the umbrella was limits to excluding Islam in the liberal state. So even this most extreme form of Islamic dress in the end has to be tolerated. One has to let it go, however we may disagree and dislike it. Well, the story moved on, as we know, and by July I had to rewrite it because a law was passed that the concerted legal opinion in France had said is not possible. That had been the outcome of the parliamentary commission headed by this communist deputy from a suburb of Lyon. Guérin is his name. They wanted that law from the start, but the dozen-plus lawyers that were testifying to the commission all said the same. It is not possible. So I'm investigating here the extraordinarily high legal constitutional hurdles that had to be taken to make this prohibition possible. The first thing to see here is the context of that campaign is not to roll back the institutional accommodation of Islam in France. That had already happened by then. I just quote some elements of it: to fund mosques on a kind of priority note to redress historical disadvantage vis-à-vis the Christians through this not cultural but cultural angle. Secondly, these bail emphytique, which makes it very affordable to buy land from the French state for building mosques, etc., etc. Islam is to be established, and to a certain degree has been institutionally established, on a floor of equality with the other great religions. I'm quoting Nicolas Sarkozy here. An American observer from the Brookings Institution, who's not exactly celebrating the French in that respect, he said, negative rhetoric and repressive measures that have put Muslim communities on the defensive belie a broader trend toward greater religious freedom and institutional representation. So there's a double reality going on here, and the Burqa reality is only one. Of course, it's the one that is mediatized, that is put into scene, and that is more visible than the hidden institutional accommodation of this religion. Now, the interesting thing is of this entire Burqa campaign,
just because it is not meant to kick out Islam from the fabric of French and European society. So the move is presented as one that is political and not religious in nature. The argument is made, the burqa is not part of Islam. You don't find a prescription for full body veiling anywhere in the core doctrine of Islam. So it is a political phenomenon, not a religious phenomenon. However ridiculous that justification is, it has been proffered in order, and from that point of view, you can even say, yeah, to go against the burqa is actually the final moment of institutionalizing and recognizing Islam in France. To reject the integral veil is to respect Islam, as the forever slick ex-immigration minister Eric Bisson has put it before the Burqa Commission. Now, that is the context. Now to this main body of my interest here, the flawed legal basis for a burqa ban. So this whole event gives us a fascinating window into something larger, into how politics has become juridicialized, has become constitutionalized. It's a case of judicialized politics. Martin Shapiro, who is known here in Berkeley, called that a politics that is conducted through the medium of legal discourse. So these guys before the Burqa Commission, or on the Burqa Commission, they cited all these lawyers, they got nice honoraria, and they were all testifying, and they were all saying the same thing. It is not possible. And at one point, one exasperated commission member said, we have to liberate ourselves from the clutches, the decision of justices. Now, so what were the possible legal cum normative arguments in favor of the burqa ban, each single of which has been gunned down by legal opinion? First, of course, laïcité. That doesn't work for two reasons. First, laïcité is a principle that weighs on the state and not on private persons. I'm quoting from one statement by Denis de Berchillon before the Burqa Commission. Laïcité is only something in the context of state institutions. They have to be neutral and laic. It is not something that you can impose on ordinary people on the street. Laïcité is not that. Whatever it is not that. The second reason that laïcité had to be quickly discarded as a ground for gunning down the burqa is, well, the premise is this is a political phenomenon. It is not a religious phenomenon. And laïcité is there to regulate religion. Ergo, you cannot use it in order to prohibit something that is political in nature and not religious in nature. So comes the second possibility. And that had become then, as laïcité was quickly off the table, to the dismay of the good members of the commission, of the Burqa Commission, the second rescue valve was to say, it violates human dignity. And that became the main attempt to try it through the root of the burqa violates human dignity, and is our responsibility as lawmakers to act on that. Now, that is a very complex concept. Kant defined dignity as the condition of being an end in itself and not just a value relative to some other purpose, which Kant calls the relative value. He calls it the price of that thing. Human dignity, whatever it is, you can take it from a subjective point of view and from an objective point of view. From a subjective point of view, human dignity is exercised in the freedom of choice of the individual. That is that which kind of distinguishes us as humans from the animal kingdom, to be able to choose. That is the subjective reading of it. There's also an objective reading of human dignity, and here it's a bit more complex. Here you could see dignity is an objective image of humanity that may be brought against the individual, even if she violates this dignity against herself. And a subjective reading of dignity, that is not possible. Here, dignity merges with freedom of choice, and ergo can be violated only by a third party. And of course, you needed an objective reading of dignity for a restriction of the burqa. Already in light of the sociological fact, the Commission members acknowledged that the burqa is chosen. They did not jump to the argument, which was quite prominent in the foulard restriction a few years earlier, to say that they are bossed by uncles and fathers and male relatives in their banlieue environments. No, the little we know about the sociological reality of the burqa, it is freely chosen. So then you need an objective definition of the burqa in order to gun it down on legal grounds. A subjective understanding of dignity, a subjective understanding of dignity becomes a defense for the burqa, because the burqa woman, in choosing the burqa, exercises her dignity. So that is a quite complex, interesting discussion here. Why was an objective reading of the burqa discarded? First, because it would push the state into the pursuit of an ethical project, and that would cross out political liberalism, and even the French state is a liberal state and has to respect such things. Secondly, an objective reading of dignity, then you cannot ration that principle, say, between a public sphere in which you go against it and a private sphere in which you let it go. If it's really an objective violation of the person, of the human person, inflicted by the person herself against her own best interest, then you have to follow that all the way through, not just in the public realm, but in her bedroom, in her apartment. You have to really make a total prohibition of that thing if dignity is meant to be in an objective way. And thirdly, and not lastly here, dignity in legal terms has been understood in a subjective way and not in an objective way. So it's rather, in the end, a defense of the burqa and not a possibility for the French state to prohibit it. So that is the human dignity side, and it seemed to be the outcome of the deliberations and the testimony. On the basis of human dignity, you cannot justify a complete, across-the-board prohibition of the burqa in all public spaces, just because legal opinion interprets it in a subjective way, and then it is becoming a defense of the choice of the individual, ergo a defense of the burqa in itself. The last possibility to go against the burqa was to say it violates public order. There was a last resort. And public order you can read, again, as a legal concept in different ways. The most elementary way is security. The burqa violates public security. However, on that ground, you can only arrive at a partial prohibition. Say, on airports, in train stations, where under the cloak of that dress you can carry guns and Kalashnikovs and even hide as a male and escape Britain, as it happened to the most wanted man of Britain who escaped under the burqa of his sister. This is not a joke, it's a real life event. So you don't get an across-the-board prohibition on the basis of public order interpreted as security. There is a second dimension to public order, public morality. And interestingly, the lawyers before the burqa commission said, also that is no possibility. There was once a time when in French beach towns, the mayors would say you cannot walk on Main Street in bathing trousers or with a provocative bikini. You have to really dress up properly. And there was a time when courts would say, yes, for the sake of public morality, you can do that. But this whole legislation has kind of died out in France. And today, such prohibitions are no longer thinkable exactly because the state is no longer an ethical watchdog, but has to retreat from regulating the ways of life of ordinary people. Of course, a moral definition of public order would exactly become the basis of the eventual law. I will come to that in a second. So that seemed to be the state of affairs in March 2010. The smartest lawyer before the commission, one from the Provincial University of Po in the Pyrenees, his name is Denis de Berchillon, he concluded the whole story for me, the best possible conclusion. He said, I don't like the burqa, it disgusts me, but I don't believe that we have the tools and the political culture for prohibiting the wearing of such dress on the territory of the Republic. Enters politics. Politics against the law. I had to rewrite the entire paper with this last new section. Politics against the law. Sarkozy responded to the Conseil d'État verdict in March. We will see. We are politicians. We are not lawyers. We have to take risk. We have to take responsibility. Risk-taking political responsibility against the wisdom of the legal case in France. That became the entry into this last round, which would end in the successful passing of the total burqa, passing this total burqa prohibition in all public. We have to be ready to take judicial risks, the Prime Minister of France, François Fillon, exclaimed in late April 2010. So one has to read the eventual making of the law as a political backlash against a perceived dictate of the legal system. I think a lot of Muslim-Islam integration in Europe has been achieved through the legal route, kind of the silent route. People were not aware of all these court judgments from low to higher instances, which in the end were all very generous, very accommodating, very inclusive. And here politics now steps in and says, we have to stop the reign of unelected judges. And we have to reassert our responsibility as democratic lawmakers. And they still needed a justification, right? And there were probably a few fall men in the legal case who provided now Sarkozy and his friends with the clues. And that clue was ironically anticipated in the Conseil d'État verdict against the total prohibition in March 2010. Namely, the court said there is a non-material dimension to public order, a moral dimension, as I called it earlier, to public order. And the court said here, public order rests on a minimal fundament of reciprocity and of essential guarantees of life in society. Reciprocity became the key term here. We are speaking, after all, the land of Durkheim. And in the land of Durkheim, the irony is there had been a lot of legal, cases and a lot of legal theorizing on the first two elements of the Republican triptych, which is, of course, liberty and equality. But fraternity, interestingly, had been left out so far. So there was like a terra incognita, white space that could be filled out with legal meaning, with legal judgment. And we know incest is prohibited, polygamy is prohibited, nudity in public is prohibited. So why not prohibit the exact opposite of nudity, the complete veiling and hiding of one's identity? So that became the justification in the end. Reciprocity belongs to the social fabric in public places. If reciprocity is interrupted, and the burqa woman interrupts reciprocity because she sees, but that does not allow herself to be seen. And in that sense, it's symbolic violence. As Elisabeth Badinter said, without any irony, it's symbolic violence which is inflicted by the burqa on third parties and on that you can legislate. And I quote from a Fall woman, Anne Lavande, who, hi Anne, is a Sorbonne law professor, and she said in big terms before the commission, neither laicity, nor dignity, nor public order could ever just justify a general and absolute prohibition. The three grounds which I played through here. And now she says, in a new hearing, in the context of the parliamentary preparations of the law, the immaterial dimension of public order is, quote, an indispensable counterweight to the excesses of the absolute primacy of individual rights. Well, I really asked Professor Levant how she combined that statement with her own previous statement before the Burka Commission. Now, of course, the whole immaterial public order justification brings back indignity. That stands behind it as the main justification of a socialist opposition deputy, Jean Glavany, called the trick. You claim not to invoke the principle of dignity, but this is finally the only principle that is written into your law text. Okay, so enters the Conseil Constitutionnel. And with that, I'm really coming to a close here. I think I have 1 more minute. Now you might think the Conseil Constitutionnel finally clears up the thing and says, niet, no. The Conseil Constitutionnel, they said, no problem. No problem. The burqa, I quote, is manifestly incompatible with the constitutional principles of liberty and equality. Now that is a stretch, if not an impossibility, by the predominant legal reasoning. They only would have to read all the testimony before the commission before they make such a statement here. Who is on the Conseil Constitutionnel? Not professional lawyers, not judges. Jacques Chirac, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Jean-Louis Debré, all UMP, conservative politicians. They are in retirement. Now they get a nice new little pension, state pension through being on that court. And of course, these are UMP guys, and they will not throw sand into the machinery of their own party in power in terms of now saying anything else, but it's no problem. However, and this is really my last word, there's an interesting religious proviso introduced into the caustic 3-page judgment here. Namely, the burqa prohibition, quote, shall not restrict the exercise of religious liberty in places of cult that are open to the public. Patrick Weil, my good friend, has written a brilliant editorial in Le Monde, and what he says there is, this unveils the religious object of the law. Finally, at the very tail end of the whole campaign, the highest court in France in that respect, judging the validity of the law proposal with the Constitution, says, yeah, there's a religious dimension to it. But the entry into that whole thing was, it is not at all religious, it is political. The show has been, the curtain has been unveiled, as it were. And that makes the, to give you an example, what that means is quite significant. A burqa woman decides to go to this Notre Dame in the center of Lutetia, of old Paris. And Catholic churches have nothing against the burqa. So will the police interrupt the short 2-minute walk of that woman from her apartment to Notre Dame in order then to, of course, walk rather freely? It's all public space. You don't really know. Is it church? Is it not? It's Paris and a lot of tourists from Japan, from Bavaria, right? You see, there is a real problem created by the religious proviso in the Conseil Constitutionnel agreement to the law against the burqa, and it opens up, that is only for lawyers interesting, but it shows the whole story has not come to an end yet. Namely, there's an interesting, I know my time's finished, Arslan versus Turkey decision by the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg just in the moment when the burqa law came into, or the burqa campaign came into high gear. And that prohibition, or that verdict, actually established a distinction between restricting dress in public institutions, which the state is allowed to do only if public servants are restricted by it. And on the other hand, you have dress restrictions in public places that are open to all, like streets or places, and that are addressed to simple citizens. The second thing is an Article 9 violation, a violation of religious liberty under the European Convention of Human Rights. And now that the religious proviso has been put into the decision of the Conseil Constitutionnel, the Arslan judgment of the ECHR becomes directly relevant. And if the court is consistent and will not hide, as it has frequently done, behind this margin of appreciation cautele, then indeed this law may still be found in violation of the European human rights regime.
Okay, we finally have our discussant, Professor Sarah Song.
So this is a very difficult time of day. So thank you very much for bearing with this marathon panel. 2.5 hours, we're in the last 30 minutes of it. So, and I have I was listening to these rich presentations. I only read 3 of the 5 papers, and so you'll be able to tell which 2 I didn't read based on the comments that I raised. I'm just going to raise some brief comments and questions about each of them, taking each paper on its own terms in the hope of generating discussion amongst the panelists, but also with everybody else. Let me first just highlight some general themes before moving on to raise specific questions and comments. So general themes that almost all of the papers speak to on this panel. So the idea of the sacred is present not only in religious form, but also in secular form. The use and abuse of religious symbols for the purposes of constructing and reinforcing national identity and social cohesion is the term that Silvio Ferrari used this morning. The dissociation between certain religious markers, such as the burqa, and religious faith. And then also this kind of broader question about how our normative frameworks of the public sphere can be rethought to be more inclusive of religion. And then the appeal to security and public order, including public morality, as moral and legal grounds for restricting religion in the public sphere. Okay, so first to Genevieve's paper. I studied in England, and I had a Polish roommate. And at the tail end of my studies, I visited Poland. It was 1998, and I visited Auschwitz. And I remember seeing those crosses and being really perplexed at why they were there. And so your presentation helped me think about that. When we think about, so in your presentation, you talked about the cross, both in the presidential palace square, but also the crosses outside Auschwitz is kind of defended as a symbol of Polishness. The cross designates, I think you had a quotation, the place of national memory. And so you describe this as the religious symbol is secularized for the purposes of national identity and social cohesion. And then you make this move and you say the symbol is actually resacralized in secular form. And I just wondered if you could say more. I was curious to hear more about this notion of the sacred in secular form. You made reference to civil religion, which made me immediately think of Rousseau and his discussion of civil religion and patriotism as the sacred and secular form. And so immediately when you begin talking about the sacred and secular form, the question comes to mind, what's the difference between that and the sacred and religious form? And are there any meaningful differences in the case that you're looking at? Okay, to Matthew's paper. So this paper proceeds by way of critique of the traditional view of religion and secularity as oppositional and dichotomous concepts, and then offers a reconceptualization of the religious and secular by drawing on the concept of the sacred. And so I thought that Matthew and Genevieve's paper had interesting overlaps. The sacred is a category boundary, he says, that sets things with non-negotiable value, apart from things whose value is based on continuous transactions. So if we adopt this definition of the sacred, Matthew suggests, we see that not only are religious values sacred, but so are secular values, for example, the Western liberal values of freedom of expression. So in the Rushdie case, both those who supported Khomeini's fatwa against Rushdie and those Western liberals, including Rushdie himself, who invoke ideas of freedom of expression and the idea of a democratic society, both sides are invoking non-negotiable values. Both sides are invoking sacred ideas. So my comments. I'm still not entirely clear what constitutes the sacred in your paper. Is it simply the invocation of a non-negotiable abstract value that gets it to count as sacred? Why can't we say that in the case of both the religious and the secular, what's at stake is values, beliefs, right? What is the idea of this sacred add that isn't captured by simply using the concept of value? Is it something being non-negotiable that makes it sacred? Does there need to be some invocation of an extratemporal or non-human authority to make something sacred? And so these questions came up for me as I was reading your paper. A second question emerges from comparing the sacred of the secular with the sacred of the religious. And are there any interesting differences between the two? And this is the question I posed to Genevieve. So Rushdie and his defenders might say that the sacred of the secular, so freedom of expression, for example, or the idea of a democratic society, these ideas have or aspire to have authority over a greater range of individuals across different religions. So when they come into conflict with the sacred of the religious, the secular should trump. Right? In other words, sacred ideas of the secular aspire to be more pluralistic, and this is supposed to give them greater authority. And so that might be one way in which a Western liberal might distinguish between the sacred of the secular and the sacred of the religious. I just had another question. This is more insider baseball, but really getting into your paper about your discussion of the marker of this, what you're calling external legitimating authority. And in the case of religious belief, the legitimating authority is God, right, for some. And is external in the sense that the authority is external to man or to human community. But in what sense is the secular belief in freedom of expression or in democracy external? So is the idea of certain rights being fundamental rights, so the idea of certain rights being fundamental is abstract and may transcend a particular situation. So is it external simply because it transcends the particular situation? So external is equivalent of universal. But these ideas might be said to originate from human beings, so in this sense aren't external in the sense that there's an extratemporal authority that we're invoking. So I just wondered about the use of the term external there and talking about legitimating authority. On to Valerie's paper. So a central claim of her paper is that religion remains unintelligible to secular publics and therefore absent from public discussions about the ban on the burqa in France and elsewhere in Europe. And I wondered if you could say more about why religion is absent. So focusing on France in particular, on the one hand, the absence is not surprising if one thinks about the power of laïcité on French public life. On the other hand, the absence of religion in public discourse about the burqa is deeply counterintuitive, since some women who don the burqa may view their decisions about what to wear as religious practices. So how can I think this is just someone observing this and not knowing much about, how can the French debate the wearing of the burqa or even the headscarf without thinking about these practices as religious practices? And I think the discussion has already gotten at the answer. By dissociating religious faith and the burqa, you permit the burqa to stand for nothing that's worth protecting, that's only worthy of our scorn or prejudice. So it made me wonder if this dissociation is a strategic one, or if the dissociation stems from other sources. I was really interested in your point about silence and inaction on the part of anti-racist groups in the debates about the burqa. And you suggest one reason why they've held back. You say because they don't want to play into the narrative of the Muslim woman as victim who requires rescue. So this brings gender and concerns about women's agency into the discussion. I wonder if you could say more about these anti-racist groups, and in particular, if there are other motivations, or if what I've just articulated is the primary motivation. Are there other motivations for their not wanting to get involved in this debate? Does their silence also stem from a genuine belief that the ban on the burqa is justifiable based on some concern for gender inequality in Muslim communities? Does that have any part to do with it? I also wondered, what are French feminists saying about the ban on the burqa? Are they mysteriously silent as well? They're never silent. Okay. When reading your paper, I couldn't help but think about the value of, and I think that this is probably where it's going, a more comparative analysis that looks at comparative racialization of Muslims in France, elsewhere in Europe, but also in North America. So my colleague, sitting next to me, Letty Volpe, has written about the racialization of persons who appear Middle Eastern Arab or Muslim in the post-9/11 context in the US, and how they're identified as terrorists outside the circle of citizenship. And I wondered if one important difference in a comparative racialization study when you're thinking about France is the legacy of colonialism in the context of contemporary immigration in France. And so in France, the vexed relations between the metropole and the post-colonial migrants and their descendants. And you made reference quickly to the post-colonial relation, but didn't go into it. But I wondered how that plays a role in explaining the absence of religion in public discourse around the burqa. Okay. So onwards to Romain's paper, who takes us inside the exercise of Islamic religious authority. And unfortunately, I didn't have the paper here, so I'm just going off the presentation. But in contrast to the other papers and presentations, he looks not at the state or mainstream political discourse or public discourse, but he's getting inside Islamic communities. And he's looking at imams as agents of regulation of religiosities, as he puts it. But the work that and I think his paper shows, or his presentation, shows us that in thinking about the role of religion in the public sphere, we have to complicate our view of religion and how it's changing and adapting globally in response to global events, but also locally. And so the work that imams do is changing and diversifying. You talk about the blurring of the border between issuing advice and issuing fatwa. The changing role of the use of speeches to show harmony increasingly between the modern sciences and the Quran. You say that the specific goal of the imam is to attempt to create consensus, but that the, quote, pluralism and democratization of the religious authority complicate it. And I wondered if you could say more about the sources of the democratization of theological and legal thought among the imamate in France and what's driving that democratization. Is it response to external conditions? Is it internal? It's probably both. And what are some of those forces? And I also wondered, in the abstract that I read on the web, you say that you've done some interviews in the US, and it seems that maybe you're looking also in a comparative direction. And I wondered if you had any preliminary insights produced by your preliminary interviews in the US context into your study of the Imam Ismailologist. Finally, to Christian's paper, he begins by noting the institutionalization of Islam in France. The negative rhetoric against Muslims in France belies, he says, a broader trend toward greater religious freedom and greater institutional representation of Muslims. I wonder how this observation relates to Valerie's claims about the broader trend of the racialization of Muslims in France. So Christian suggests that it's misleading to think about the French discourse around the burqa as part of a, quote, all-European assault on Islam and Muslims. For example, he points to the Swiss national referendum against the construction of new minarets and observes there are no institutional channels for the French to enact a similar sort of restriction. But what about at the level of individual attitudes toward Muslims? The French state may be intent on funding mosque constructions by handing out long-term loans for building sites, but do the French people broadly support such measures? And I was trying to reconcile Valerie's paper very late last night with Christian's, and wondering, so when Valerie speaks of the racialization of Muslims, is she talking about individual attitudes, about French national identity and culture and responses to Muslims in France, whereas Christian is talking about legal and political institutions and what restrictions on Islam are in fact possible? Christian suggests if you look at the broader context of institutions, it's misleading to say that the ban on the burqa is driven simply by prejudice against Islam. Is that right? On the question of whether the burqa is a religious symbol, I was fascinated to read about Tariq Ramadan and the anthropologist Dunia Buzar saying that the burqa and niqab are, quote, not an Islamic prescription. On the sociological account of burqa wearing, there are three motivations for donning the burqa. They're not religious. So first, symbolic protest. Second, quest for social distinction. And third, hyper-individualism about the ethnic origin community. Are there really no women who wear the burqa out of religious conviction? again, this is getting at the dissociation between this religious marker and religious faith, on the other hand. If some women view wearing the burqa as religious practice, then the attempt to dissociate the burqa from Islam cannot succeed. And so my question is this: what's behind this dissociation? Who's driving it? Is this dissociation desirable? And is the attempt to dissociate the burqa from Islamic faith actually reinforcing the connection between the two amongst those who wish to don it? And kind of, so the state, public discourse attempts to dissociate it, but then individuals, kind of who are the affected parties, are actually drawing a closer connection between it as a result of the attempt to dissociate it. So holding the practice of wearing, continuing on with Christian's paper, holding the practice of wearing burqas against the Republican triptych of liberty, equality, fraternity, Christian says that liberty, and in particular freedom of religion, requires respecting the freedom of choice to wear the burqa. So here, there isn't a compelling case that can be made that freedom is being violated. But the burqa runs against the other two parts of the Republican ideal: equality, in particular equality between the sexes, and fraternity. And I was really interested to learn that the Burqa Commission report cites the work of Levinas on the face as the mirror of the soul, and the site of humanism and the site of individualism as the mark of the West. Only the entire face, not just the eyes or nose, has this quality of expressing the soul. And here it made me think of Matthew and Genevieve talking about the sacred in the secular realm. Okay, so at various points in the paper, Christian hints that part of what's behind the effort to restrict Islam is the never-ending project of nation building and national identity formation. One way of thinking about the total burqa ban in Belgium, and, quote, the front against Islam more generally, is as the best means available for political elites to unify and mobilize a majority of the Belgian electorate, which was dissolving into the French and Flemish-speaking parts, as Christian highlights. As is often the case, then, the solidarity of the French Republic, or the Belgian society, is kind of attempted to be constructed out of an opposition to an other. And again, so using these religious markers as a way to rally and solidify national identity. So I just wanted to conclude by asking, I guess, a question of all of the panelists and actually everyone in the audience, because this is kind of a theme about religious norms in the public sphere. Earlier in the morning, Charles Hirschkin invoked Tocqueville, who's such a congenial theorist when thinking about religion and its relationship to the public sphere and democracy. And also because I was finalizing final exams last night and I was thinking about Marx, I wanted to kind of... this semester I taught Marx's On the Jewish Question, and he gives us several different models about thinking about religion in the public sphere. The separation model, right, which is the kind of what we sometimes refer to as the liberal neutrality model. And there are moments where I think that Christian is very sympathetic to this liberal neutrality model, especially what he said this morning about the Italian case of the cross in the public schools. And then an assimilation model, the dominant religion or the dominant racial identity is instantiated in the state and all must assimilate into it. Maybe this is Sarkozy, maybe this is Berlusconi, I don't and then the Marxist model, which no one in this room probably adheres to, human emancipation, genuine emancipation, transcending religion altogether. There was a lot of talk this morning, and I think in these papers also, that the most desirable normative model seems to be a kind of pluralistic one. I took Silvio Ferrari's comments this morning, what he called inclusive neutrality, to be a kind of a broadening of the liberal neutrality model, but to be more pluralistic, but retaining aspects of the liberal model and making it more pluralistic. Peter Danchen's talking about value pluralism. I took that to be looking for something beyond liberalism, beyond the liberal neutrality model. And so it was interesting, and this is kind of just a comment or a question for all of the panelists as to, and it wasn't necessarily explicitly discussed in all of your papers, about the implicit normative models underlying your discussions of the particular cases that you're engaged in.
So with Hetty's permission, we're just going to collect a couple questions and then allow each panelist 1 or 2 minutes to respond to any of what they've heard, either from Professor Song or these questions, comments.
My remark is there is some kind of parallelism between the Italian and the French governments. The Italian government said the crucifix is not religious, so it must stay there. The French government said that the burqa is not religious, so it has to go. In a way, the two strategies are based on the statement this symbol has not a religious nature. And I wonder why. And in my opinion, it's possible to imagine a couple of explanations. First, it is a strategy of nationalization of symbols. What was said this morning. You cannot nationalize a religious symbol without stripping it of its faith significance. So you have to say this is not religious, and then can be nationalized. First possibility. Second possibility. In most European states, there is the idea that religion is a matter upon which a state has no competence, because it's something spiritual, different from the temporal, and spiritual is a church, temporal is state. And so by affirming the secular nature of the burqa or of the crucifix, the state can say, this is my domain. I can rule as I wish. And a third and final possible explanation, it is a strategy to put out of the picture the individual right of religious freedom. If it is not something religious, the burqa, I cannot say you are infringing my religious freedom when you prevent me from wearing it. I can try some kind of cultural defense, but it's much weaker than the defense provided by religious freedom.
My question is for Valerie and Moreau. I was just wondering, what is the role of converts in the racialization of the burqa?
Thank you all for your presentations. Romain, I have a question for you about, maybe if you can clarify, maybe I've misunderstood, but the kind of ambiguous construction you're referring to in terms of the imams, it almost came across as part of the democratization or kind of liberal understanding of the multiple communities and audiences that the imams relate to is external to the ways in which they might imagine these things within an Islamic tradition. So it sounded a little bit too reified to me to think that and again, maybe I misunderstood, but that these kind of democratic ideals are external to what the imams otherwise what could be internal to an Islamic tradition. It almost sounded like it was, the project of democratization belongs to kind of liberal secular modernity, and then there's the Islamic tradition, and they have to find some kind of fit. Well, everyone does that, right? I mean, so there's two parts. One is, can you clarify that? And then the question is, then given that, what's so exceptional about this kind of negotiation? I mean, everyone negotiates. Different audiences, different ways in which to enact. I mean, are there funding sources that this is tied to? As you know, I was with you in Paris last summer doing research also with imams. I mean, some of them are paid, some of them are unpaid, some of them are seen as puppets of the state, so they say the right things. So first the clarification, and then second, what are the interests involved in this kind of democratization process?
Just go down the row, and if you have any responses, closing words, keep it brief.
Just shortly to the converts question, thank you. It's what I call, and I double-checked with Sarah because I wanted to be sure not to be too French in my answer. So apparently oxymoron exists in English. So I would say that converts are socially the oxymoron of this. If I want to try to really have converging the double dimensions, at least, that they embody. First, most of the women under the burqa, and we know that because now we have for the first time a study that is really going behind the burqa that has just been released by the Open Society Institute few weeks ago. And most of the 32 women that are answering the questions are people who converted to Islam. And interestingly enough, all of them, because there are huge, I invite all of you to go if you're interested in the argument, because there are large extracts of their interview and answers to the questions, and they all mention the religious motive as a central motive of their decision and of their decision to stick to wearing the burqa where they're allowed to do it, which is getting tiny and tiny. What I mean by oxymoron is that most of the anti-racist mobilization to defend and plead against this racialization of Muslims that has been starting 20 years ago in the French context has been led by converts. The most active association is a convert-led one, which is the 15 Mars, Association 15 Mars et Liberté, who is led by Abdallah Milsan, who is a famous North activist. He's in Alsace. And he's a doctor. He's very active in pleading for the recognition of this process of racism, anti-racism that is specifically targeting Muslims. And but his voice has been always very limited. He's very famous outside France, but it's very, very limited to a specific audience when it comes to speaking up and going public. So I would say that they are in an oxymoron in the sense that, on the one hand, they are the most central actors when you look at the burqa discussion. On the other hand, they are the less significant ones if you come to the political meaning of this racialization process. Then you had a lot of questions, so I'm not answering to everyone, but I thank you because they're an invitation to develop the arguments in the paper. So Letty's work, of course, I'm quoting her also in the paper because I think what's happening in Europe is that this racialization process is going on independently from the post-9/11 events. It's something that is really detached from this World Trade Center attack, from the towers attack, from the terrorist discussion. It's something that has gained independence, a political own autonomy, and that is really, really, according to me, very much anchored in this incapacity from a larger public to connect that with racialization that is really anchored also in the historical background. If you look at what happened to Muslims and Islam during the period of the presence of the French in Algeria, it's very, you can just draw the line between the different dots, and the burqa would be the final one, hopefully. So that's also the part of the answer to the comparison with eventually the US, where, of course, and that's where Ford's work and your work is also very, very useful for me, because it really connects color, religion, and racialization in both contexts. I really like the answers by Silvio to your question about religion. Why is it so difficult to just incorporate and recognize religion as religion, Muslims qua Muslims, that is not only as cultural groups, not only as ethnic minorities, but as a religious groups composed of individuals that are sociologically acting on behalf of specific motives in the sociological meaning, in the Weberian perspective. And if you are taking up seriously this motivation, religion is part of it. And that's where the ethnography of the ordinary religion is becoming very interesting, because it fits with what you were saying, that in most of the European context, and in particular in France, this, what Mahmoud called this secular/religious divide, this secular/religious borders that is really made as a wall inside this context, is pretty much born from this idea of a reciprocal incompetence between, on the one hand, the state, on the other hand, churches, with an S. And I think this is part of the explanation, that we have a political culture that is grounded on that. And that's why I think that the example of Notre Dame at the end of Christian's talk is not really the right one, because we know in France from history that churches remain places where you can't be touched. That's where all political activism for defending refugees is taking place. That's where traditionally all our main figures that were opposing regimes ended up being protected, including Muslims in the 70s. They found protection inside churches to have their prayers. So this idea of the reciprocal incompetence is also something that I always quote to my students. The first page of Olivier's book on Islam and the Republic, where you have this illustration based on Tariq Ramadan's discussion with Sarkozy, in which you say that the problem in France is to really stick to this line of secularism in a concrete way, meaning if you cross the border, it can be easily that you're on the other side, but you don't recognize that you're on the other side. For instance, when we had this public discussion between Sarkozy and Ramadan about the stone throwing, and that Sarkozy kept inviting Ramadan, saying, say something against it. Please, as a Muslim, as a public figure, give us your opinion. It was 2003 in the framework of the institutionalization process of Islam in France. And the only secular answer was the one Ramadan was giving to Sarkozy, saying, as a citizen, I'm condemning it. As a Muslim, I don't have the competence, I don't have the authority to give you any answer. It's not my competence, my domain of competence. This was really respectful, very strategically, tactically, okay, we can discuss that afterwards, but it was really respectful of the line, which was not the case of Sarkozy, who was systematically jaywalking, crossing the line, and inviting a religious believer that was here as an individual to make a statement in the name of a religious group, as a religious authority, that he is not. So this line is something that is raised, I think this is maybe the only specificity to French long history, and I make it short.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to Sarah for amazing comments, especially given the task. It's tour de force. You asked about the sacred as it relates to the religious and the secular. And I just want to say a few words. There's a sacred of the religious that we talk about all the time, and there's a sacred of the secular, which would be civil religion. And what I was trying to show, and what I do in my book also, is to show how in the Polish case you have the sacred of the secularized religious. And that's a process that happens over, more than a century. So that in Poland, Catholicism through the 19th and 20th centuries has become a civil religion that was taken for granted and not contentious under communism for obvious reasons. So that even believers, non-believers, and non-Catholic, non-Christians would agree about the value of Catholicism as a civil religion. Now, after 1989, with the fall of communism and with the construction of a legitimate state, of a state that is recognized as legitimate by its population and as a national state, you no longer actually need that civil religion. You have political symbols that can be sacralized, and you can build a new civil religion. And that's at that moment that then the cross become really an issue. So the cross can be... some people would argue to get rid of the cross as a religious symbol or get rid of the cross as a national symbol, and these are not necessarily the same people. Some people argue for both. Some argue for getting rid of the symbol as like Catholics, for example, who are practicing, some wings of the Catholic Church, for example, are really, really strong and keen on getting rid of the cross as when it's used as a national symbol because they see that as a profanation of the symbol, actually. And then you have people who argue to keep the cross as a religious or a national symbol. So I think it's important when you look at debates about the presence of religious symbols, what we call religious is not always religious. And it depends on the place, the arguments made, the intentions of the actors so some people at Auschwitz, for example, were bringing the cross not at all as religious symbols. And they were not always anti-Semitic gestures. Very often they were made against secular authorities who were trying to secularize national identity in Poland. So I think that in our analyses, we need to be very, very careful of looking at one thing because those symbols are polysemic, multivalent, and in time and context really makes a big difference. And I will...
And thank you also, Sarah, for amazing comments on such a large panel. I'll just briefly deal with one of the comments that you raised, which was just asking more questions about how we can define the sacred and how the sacred is different to value. And using the word sacred carries with it a certain amount of baggage, which tends to lend itself in most people's minds to religious connotations and not so easily to secular connotations. And this is something that's recognized by scholars such as Anne Taves, for example, who talks about specialness and does so in trying to avoid some of the baggage that comes with the term the sacred, but still uses it in a similar way to how I've and how we've applied it in this paper. In your comments, you actually referred to where I talked about the sacred as a category boundary, and of course there's a quotation in the paper which I didn't mention in the presentation for time, which perhaps I'll just mention quickly now. And this was from Veikko Antonen, the Finnish scholar writing about the sacred. Sacrality is employed as a category boundary to set things with non-negotiable value apart from things whose value is based on continuous transactions. People participate in sacred-making activities and processes of signification according to paradigms given by the belief systems to which they are committed, whether they be religious, national, or ideological. And part of how we see the sacred then in this context is, as you mentioned, as non-negotiable value, so something which is set apart from those things which the value which we negotiate on a day-to-day basis, so strongly held or non-negotiable value. But it's also the process of setting those things apart from and separate from those sort of everyday transactions. So it's a process of separation itself which we can see as a sacred. And this, of course, also raises an interesting paradox, which is something discussed by George Bataille, for example, that he highlights that in some cases the sacred needs these threatened transgressions to be realized as the sacred. So Professor Ra earlier on talked about the cross as part of the furniture on the school wall. Is it still sacred when it's just seen as part of the furniture, or is it only seen as sacred when it's threatened with transgression, when it's threatened with its removal? So again, we can see the sacred as part of this process of separation.
So thanks to Professor Song for her comments. So Munir, I should be more precise when I use the word of democratization. It's not a reference to a political concept of democracy. I just want to mean that imams exercise their authority by mediatizing the claims of the faithful. And it is interesting from my point of view because that allow to understand several aspects, several reports that we can do in the mosque. For example, I advocated the cases of the ambiguous speeches, which are very polemical in France, and it allowed to explain that from another way. It is also interesting because it suggests to look for the consequence of this way of exercise authority. For example, the case of Ramadan is very interesting because this way explain, for example, that imams tend to be more autonomous and independent from their native country, or it's not the case of president of mosque because they act as notable. And it seems to be interesting in the case of this conference because it is also a common point with other religions, for example, the Catholicism. As such, it is an aspect of the formatting of religions, and it shows the role of imams in this process of formatting.
This nice logo here says, "Let there be light." I'm the last to turn off the light here. Now, how to reconcile the two Burqa stories which we heard here today? Well, at one level, I'm tempted to respond with Alice in Wonderland. We all have won. We all get prizes. Valerie's story was racialization. My story, I'm not sure what my story actually was. It was originally meant to be a story, a heroic story of the victory of liberal inclusiveness, but it turned into a rather strange story of the spinelessness of the lawyer's guild. That is one way to actually read it, perhaps. I think you have to distinguish here at a minimum between, are you talking ordinary people and what they may think and believe with respect to here Muslims and the burqa, and the other level is public institutions. And I have absolutely no illusion that ordinary people may be very racist. They are, we know it from Eurobarometers, and there is no distinction here between France and Canadians. These are all rather mellow, perhaps, distinctions and variations on that same sad story. We don't want immigrants. We rather would be happy to stay amongst us. You know, ordinary people are illiberal, but I still would think public institutions are more liberal. And it's exactly this disjunction between what ordinary people think and what public institutions convey and express, which has been the fuel for the new right-wing populisms mushrooming across Europe. They talk the people's talk that they do not find that the political party leaders and state leaders express in their ceremonial statements. So liberal institutions are more liberal than ordinary people. And in a way, my story was more at the level of liberal institutions, of public institutions. But here again, you have to distinguish between the majority principled public institutions, that is parliaments and elected political leaders on the one hand, and on the other hand, legal institutions, constitutions, constitutional law in particular, that is meant to follow an anti-majoritarian principle, and in that respect is good for minorities. And if you look at the whole story of Muslim and Islam integration in liberal societies, you see predominantly that has been legal integration. That has been integration accomplished by liberal courts, protected from the populist virus that unfortunately by now has caught the majoritarian side of public institutions, elected political leaders. So legal integration has gone so wide that it has outpaced public opinion on these matters, on the cross being extradited from classrooms by the verdict of unelected judges, and vice versa, Foulard being tolerated. That has been the line in France until 2004. Don't forget that. So there are limits to legal integration, I think, which become very apparent in this burqa wildfire that unfortunately has struck particularly Europe today. There are limits to legal integration in that Muslims have, by and large, avoided to address the court of public opinion. They have avoided that. And in a way, this is a bath. It's not a bloodbath yet. Put it into proportion. It's a sour bath, a cold shower. It's unavoidable. We have to go through that. And in the end, I'm pretty confident that a balance will be reached between the public court finally tolerating the others amongst ourselves, and on the other side, minorities getting their fair deal and their equal place that they undoubtedly deserve to have in liberal societies.
Thank you all so much. If we could give this phenomenal panel a hand.